We were told that if we went to a Muslim home, we must knock and immediately turn our backs, since an unveiled woman might answer the door, and that we must remove our shoes if invited inside a home or a mosque. I hoped to be invited to a Tunisian home to try out my new knowledge. Marcus and Dieter, on the other hand, quickly got bored with the city, but I liked to find my way around in foreign cities, figure out the exchange rate and try to speak the language. My entertainment was going to the Kasbah, heady with strange sounds, smells and flavours. Spices, olives, grapes and citrus fruits were grown in the area and haggled over at this market. I craved oranges and soon befriended an orange seller, a few years older than I, named Amir. While we did not share a language, I used my sheet with Arabic words to communicate with him. One day he invited me to dinner in his home. His little house was typical, built of mud bricks and whitewashed. I pointed to my boots. "Do I have to take them off?" I asked. Amir wagged his finger in a no sign. The aromas coming from a corner of a room that was the kitchen made my mouth water. We sat on oriental carpets and ate from a low table set with platters of couscous, pita, vegetables, and a jug of hot sauce for dipping. I watched him eat without silverware, using only his right hand before I followed suit. We sipped strong Arabian coffee. As I expected, his wife did not eat with us. While we were dining, I asked if he could show me his mosque, which dominated the walled city. He agreed to take me when there was no religious service. Since my arrival, I had heard the call of the muezzins from the nearby mosque calling their faithful to prayer 5 times a day. I saw men stop what they were doing to get out their prayer rugs and kneel before God. I was curious to see the inside of the famous mosque. What was different? Would the answer to what made them act so religious be inside? I wondered. Although Christian, a baptized and confirmed Lutheran, I did not feel as closely connected to my church as I had as a child. Religious observations were discouraged under Hitler's rule. My parents told me they felt torn and confused about the absence of religion in their lives. I knew little of the other 2 major religions, Judaism and Islam. Now here was something to write home about. After dinner, Amir and I approached the enormous mosque. It rose high above the flat-roofed mud houses. A tower on its roof overlooked the city. "Do I have to take my boots off?" I asked Amir once again, pointing to my feet. He clicked his tongue several times in admonishment that I would have to even ask. He motioned me to take them off. Leaving my irreplaceable boots outside was a leap of faith. I tried to keep an eye on them while I marvelled over the interior of the mosque, vastly different from my home church in Kiel, Germany. Open to the outdoors, the mosque's most remarkable features were its brightness and its columns arranged in rows in an interior devoid of benches and chairs. Amir pointed to the wall ahead of us and said, "Mecca." I understood that the wall we stood before faced Mecca. The enormous room was divided by a grille into male and female sections and decorated with brightly painted mosaic tiles. Amir gave me a privileged glimpse into Islam. I had forgotten about my boots. I hurried back outside. My boots must have attracted attention, but they were still there. Since I had shown so much interest in his mosque, Amir tried to tell me about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. After many attempts at words and pantomimes, I grasped the concept of the Hegira, understanding that it was the Prophet's forced journey from Mecca to a more congenial place. I wished that I had the words to describe my Lutheran church at home to this Muslim. Despite the social reaction to religion as a whole and my family's confusion, I had always been comforted by my personal faith. It gave me words to cling to as war swirled about me. Little did I know that I would soon be on my own Hegira, my own forced journey. The next day, Marcus and Dieter and I shook hands as we parted company. I was assigned to an anti-tank unit that moved to a military front somewhere around Spetla or Kasserine. Many fronts dotted the long, jagged attack and defence line. I was curious to see what a front actually looked like. I didn't know whether I felt relieved or disappointed when all I saw was more of the same desert. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's placement of my unit was a small part of a complicated plan to drive the Allies out of Tunisia. Rommel had withdrawn 1,400 miles across Egypt and Libya to arrive in Tunisia at the Mareth line in January 1943. In February, he linked up with Colonel Jürgen von Arnim of the 5th Panzer Army, which Hitler had rushed to Tunisia after America's Operation Torch landings. "The armour is the core of the motorized army," Rommel declared. "Everything turns on it." Certainly the Desert Fox based his entire campaign on this premise. The desert itself, with its flat, open terrain, provided the setting for armoured warfare in a classic form. The result was a technology race to see which nation could equip its armies with tanks that would outshoot, outmaneuver, and outlast their foes. The tanks ranged from speedy, light models for reconnaissance to heavily armoured types for assaults on fortified positions. The Americans had Sherman tanks, which could reach speeds of 25 miles an hour, and had 75mm guns in a power-driven turret. They also had Grant tanks, which were bigger and had 37mm and 75mm guns, but a design flaw hampered the larger weapon. We had Panzers. The Panzer III was speedy and manoeuvrable and carried a 50mm gun. Panzer IVs, Tiger tanks, took on machine gun nests, tanks, infantry, and anti-tank guns with a 75mm turret gun. By the time I got to Africa, we had the latest models, outfitted with thicker armour and with longer-barrelled, more powerful guns than before. Assembled at the front, I, along with the other enlisted men, waited for instructions. "Get out your shovels, boys," our sergeant said with a grin, "and make yourselves at home." We divided into 4-man teams and burrowed into the flat plain to protect ourselves from bullets and from the weather. We had with us our 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns, which we towed behind open, all-terrain, tan-painted, half-truck, half-tank vehicles. We made ourselves as comfortable as possible in our dugouts. A little ingenuity was called for. Waterproof gas mask canisters were just the thing to protect our cigarettes from getting wet. We grumbled that the officers had overburdened us with too much stuff to carry. We pitched out the pith helmets that gave us no protection from bullets or cold, but we were glad for our wool sweaters and gloves and our greatcoats. The temperature dropped as much as 60 degrees at night. We expected to see action, yet we neither saw nor heard signs of battle. They told us that the action was taking place in the north. Even so, danger was a constant companion on the front. The ground was littered with explosive mines. Tribes of desert nomads, called Bedouins, often appeared as they followed their long-established trading routes. Turbanned men, wrapped in robes and wearing leather boots, rode camels with colourfully woven saddle blankets. The Bedouins' women walked ahead to scout for mines. Women were obviously more expendable than camels in the minds of the Bedouins. Are they wives or slaves? I wondered. Watching the nomads pass by was a welcome diversion. Nearly 2 weeks passed as we camped out at this post alongside an Italian unit. Scruffy and as ill-clad as the soldiers we had seen in Italy, the Italians were different from us in other ways. Much more fun-loving than we Germans, they gathered together, drank wine, and sang on duty at night, probably hoping that British patrols would hear them and stay away. Our Italian comrades were not keen on standing watch alone. My buddies and I weren't keen on standing guard alone either. However, since we were known as highly disciplined Germans, we stoically went off solo to our watches in the dark desert. We hoped just as fervently that a Brit with a sharp knife wouldn't sneak up on us. The Italian soldiers had a wine ration doled out 1 litre a day per man, but it was tainted with the smell of the old gas canisters it was stored in. The Italians got hot pasta meals each day with their wine. We were given bread or dry toast, called zwieback, which was mouldy sometimes, and sausage or sardines in olive oil. Occasionally we were given a treat, a new chocolate bar laced with cola called Coca-Cola. As a beverage, we received clear water from jerry cans, painted with white crosses to distinguish them from gas cans. A supposedly sanitary water supply came from wells that Germans had dug in the area. Still, men stationed in Africa for long periods became jaundiced and had sores that wouldn't heal. Some of our leaders thought the jaundice was caused by the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Rommel himself tried to prove that our diet was sufficient by only eating what we did. Within 2 years, army rations in out of the battle, my buddies and I lit cigarettes, trying to calm our nerves, and waited for our ears to stop ringing. One of my buddies congratulated me with typical German sarcasm. "Well, I see you lived to fight for another day." "Ja," I blurted out. "I like to be out of fearing Rangje whenever I can. I thank God that Allied fire missed me time and time again. I'm grateful that I was never seriously wounded and was able to recover emotionally from the sickening battles. Unlike many of my peers, I lived on to get married and to raise sons and daughters. Looking back on these bloody battles, I'm glad that none of my children had to be in combat, even though 3 of our boys were in the American Armed Forces. As for the Battle of Kasserine Pass, my last major battle, I read later that the Germans won this conflict but bungled the rest, due to the dual command at this point by General Rommel and General von Arnim. Both of them answered to Marshal Albert Kesselring in Rome, and both messaged him about their plans. General Rommel wanted to exploit German gains by striking Tebessa. Von Arnim did not. Kesselring ended up siding with Rommel, but by then precious time had been lost. During the 2 days the commanders bickered, the Allies gathered enough strength to repel Rommel. While the generals argued, von Arnim shifted our troops, intending to strike farther north. Rommel took time out to examine captured US war material, tanks, trucks, troop carriers, and weapons. The abundance of supplies and the profusion of spare parts amazed him. By contrast, his forces were down to 1 day's ammunition and only 6 days' food. His vehicles had just enough gasoline to travel 120 miles. 3 days after the battle, Rommel flew to Germany to try to persuade Hitler to abandon North Africa entirely and thereby save the Afrika Korps from annihilation. Predictably, Hitler refused to listen to his argument and forbade the Desert Fox to return to Tunisia. "Africa will be held," the Führer snapped, "and you must go on sick leave." Hitler gave command of both armies to Colonel General von Arnim. As enlisted men, we knew very little about all this. When the next issue of our German army newspaper, The Oasis, reached us, we read that Rommel had fallen ill and von Arnim had replaced him. "Move out!" shouted my sergeant. We followed his lead, back in the direction we originally came, to a defensive position west of Kairouan. In April, an enormous force of American tanks attacked us in 2 skirmishes with ferocious hails of artillery. Shells flew, mortars burst, and bullets shot everywhere at once. This time, our unit was not as lucky. We couldn't move, our half-tracks had run out of fuel. Through bursts and bangs, I saw our anti-tank guns and half-tracks explode, saw our men lying dead or injured. We kept firing until we heard the order, "Retreat!" Those of us left standing abandoned our anti-tank guns and followed our sergeant into the hills. The beauty of spring in full bloom was lost on me. I felt dazed, shocked, and exhausted. The guys around me looked the same way. The loss of our vehicles turned us into foot soldiers, the infantry. With barely enough time to catch a breath, we marched off to an offensive that I later discovered to be Medjez el Bab. My unit was still attached to Gruppe Weber. The entire group included Panzergruppe Lang, with 77 tanks, 14 of them Tigers. Weber had 3 other groups. Take a good look at the height of those hills. The enemy could be up there watching us right now, Sergeant said as he squinted up at a ridge. A cold chill settled along my spine as I tried to spot British scouts above us. Years later, I read that we were on our way to take part in one of Rommel's elaborate schemes to defeat the British. Our regiment, the 47th Panzer Grenadiers, became a part of Battlegruppe Boos, led by Lieutenant Colonel Boos, our commander. We were reserves against the British, who had gathered strength by pulling in their forces Baisit in Libya. We got a taste of British fighting methods at our first skirmish. The British led their troops into the fight with the eerie whine of Scottish bagpipes, while our tough sergeant spurred us on. The ominous wheeze of the bagpipes sent jolts of adrenaline up my spine. "Man, I wish I could shut them up," I shouted over the din. "I wish I could help you do it," the sergeant said. My buddies winced and looked grim. Poised for battle, we were as ready as teenage boys could possibly. Then he taped on some bandages. Bagpipers tooted weird hoots and howls as they dogged us. Their savage shrieks sounded as if they were almost at our feet. Blasts of ammunition annihilated more of our men. Attack followed attack. Our response weakened. Even a private could see that we had run out of ammunition. New orders were shouted. "Retreat!" We scrambled to the rear and reassembled at the foot of the Atlas Mountains. We got our next order on a hill, dig in. Dirt flew thick and fast as soldiers dug as deep as possible for the next onslaught. Klaus and I dug madly, deeper and deeper, throwing dirt by the shovelful in every direction. We felt the Allies breathe down our necks. Finally satisfied with our work and hunkered down, we heard the unmistakable squeaks and rumbles of tanks grow louder as they bore down on us. Like young foxes in their dens, we tried to blend in with the desert until the sounds of war died away, included a German army newspaper called Die Oase, the Oasis, and an occasional meal of meat stew, was delivered to a field kitchen about 10 miles behind our lines. One of our all-terrain vehicle drivers had to wait until dark before he could drive back to the field kitchen to retrieve the food and precious mail. At night, British shelling was sporadic, in contrast to daytime, when they shelled continuously. One night, I was told to accompany an all-terrain vehicle driver named Max to pick up our food and mail. Visions of a yummy stew of beef, peas, and potatoes danced in my head. Max glared out into the sparkling clear night and was not pleased. "This is not a good night for a pickup." "Why?" I asked. I couldn't see any reason to be spooked. Even the moon seemed to cooperate by being as small as possible. "It's too quiet," Max said. "It's easier to make the field kitchen when we have a storm." "I thought that storms always made driving more risky," I said. "Not in this case," Max said. "You'll see what I mean." The desert was so quiet that our vehicle, made even noisier with chains on its treads, attracted British gunners before we had gone a mile. The British pinpointed us by sound alone. Shells exploded around us. Max stopped for a minute. What to do? Keep going. Turn around. As soon as he stepped on the gas, a shell exploded right where we had halted. God is watching us, I thought. I braced myself in my seat as Max sped full throttle to the field kitchen. We stopped only long enough to pick up individual cans of stew fastened together by threes, as well as a waterproof bag of mail. On the trip back, British gunners homed in on us again. Shells flew thick and fast. Max slammed on the brakes. "Grab the food! Get out!" Max shouted. "Yeah, I got it," I yelled. Max and I grabbed the mail and as many cans as we could before throwing ourselves into a crater made by artillery shells. The mouth-watering aroma of beef gravy wafted around us as we lay in the mud with shells whistling over our heads. "When can we go back?" I shouted. "When I say so," Max yelled. We stayed put until Max thought it was safe to return and to start up the vehicle. Max had exceptional night vision. He followed a trail I couldn't see and located black ditches in the dark. Twice more, Max braked to a stop near deep holes and helped me grab all the food before we hurled ourselves with the cans into the ooze. By the time we got back and delivered the mail and the food, I wasn't hungry anymore. Our little trip into the desert was one diversion I could have done without. Once a week, another kind of diversion dropped from the sky. The Africa Post was delivered via a high-altitude drop from an Allied plane. An American-generated newspaper written in German highlighted German failures on all fronts. The Post cited unsettling statistics. 3 German soldiers have died every minute of the day since June 1941. A February issue proposed a plan of surrender. "Come alone or bring other comrades," Bring your greatcoat, mess kit and shaving kit, leave your weapon, and bring, if possible, this newspaper, which will assure free passage through English, American and French lines. My buddies and I liked the cartoons, but we didn't know if anything in the Africa Post was true. Their plan for us to surrender looked like their way of getting a better shot at us. From time to time, Allied planes dropped surrender leaflets on us. Colonel General von Arnim tells you, before us, the enemy, behind us, the sea, there is no way back. Your mind tells you differently. Behind the enemy, the detention camp. Behind the detention camp, the prisoner of war camp in England or America. Behind the prisoner of war camp, home, there is a way back. The dead do not go home. But the prisoner who remains alive will see home again. I kept my confusion to myself and soldiered on. Toward the end of that filthy February, my unit was attached to Korps Gruppe Weber for an attack on British and US forces at Spitler. Both sides had been waiting for the end of the rainy season. Many years later, I learned that by March 15th, Germany's Kolgen Friedrich Weber had only 6 operational tanks remaining under his command. I also learned that in a joint strategy, the Americans and the British had combined their soldiers and war materials for their offensive. A large force of American soldiers and supplies from Algeria arrived to join the British. At Spitler, the earth beneath us shook as Allied tanks fired their mighty charges. Above the battlefield, a canopy of screeching Stuka planes dive-bombed the Allies. Incoming mortars crashed amid clumps of wildflowers, white daisies, and bright red poppies. Soon the blood of German men flowed red as the poppies when Allied shells hit their targets. Smoke, fire, and the smell of explosives and scorched earth assailed our nostrils. Temporarily deafened, I looked with dismay over the plain of exploding half-tracks and guns. A description of the biblical apocalypse I had read in childhood came to me. A hurricane of steel and fire stung my eyes and hurt my ears. I expected to be blasted to smithereens any minute, yet I didn't even know the object of the battle going on around me. My buddies and I looked at each other in wonder when we heard the next order. Cease firing. God is with me, I thought. The Allied fusillade had missed us. Our team sat down on the ground and shakily lit cigarettes. All around us, bleeding and dying men and boys murmured prayers or called for their mothers while medics did all they could. Man, that was terrible, I shouted, voicing the understatement of the year. But there were no words that I knew to describe what we had just been through. So many dead, so many dead, so many hurt, I mumbled. My head pounded and my ears rang. My team just shook their heads. Yeah. Looking back more than 50 years later, all I can say is, what a tragic waste of life. What an immeasurable loss of good men for their families, who still sadly recall husbands, fathers, and brothers who never came home. How could Hitler and his advisers have considered them expendable? What motivated Hitler and his high-ranking advisers to keep seeking more power and more glory for themselves, without giving a second thought to the boys and men they sent off to war? They didn't even know if they could keep us supplied. Later, I would confront larger issues concerning Hitler's actions. How could they disregard all the homeless, hungry women, children, and refugees? How did they think they could ever repair the infrastructure and all the devastated cities of Germany? Back then, my anti-tank team had barely enough time to gather our wits and our weapons when our sergeant said, "Pick up your gear. This regiment is moving out. We're providing field support." I figured out later that we were part of an offensive by General von Arnim that covered the area between El Ala and Fonduk. On our trek through the wooded hills toward the mountains, newly leafed-out trees provided some cover. The ground finally provided traction. We could, mercifully, set up our ponchos on some dry dirt. We had little respite before our next big fight, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. This pass was one of the few large corridors through the mountains. Although I didn't know it at the time, the battle was crucial to the enemy because the pass led to Algeria and the town of Tebessa, a vital Allied communications and supply base. Another road led to the city of Thala. With tanks and planes, Germany's Rommel pursued American troops across Tunisia to the western dorsal of the Atlas Mountains. On February 19, 1943, the Americans had to make a stand in the basin of Kasserine Pass in order to defend Tebessa. We funneled through 5 narrow passes into the basin, accompanied by shrieking Stukas. This was the first time that Axis forces faced the Americans in a major battle in Africa. Our sergeant had complete faith in Brig Gen Carl Buelowius, who launched a major artillery barrage. The sergeant scoffed at the lightweight American M3 tanks he tracked through his binoculars. "They're toys compared to our panzers. They're flimsy," he said. "A panzer can destroy an M3 in just one shot." That wasn't all. Buelowius unleashed the new weapon, the Nebelwerfer. These 6-barreled rocket launchers were said to shower the enemy with fatal missiles. Yet while I heard the whoosh of our rockets screaming toward the enemy, I saw our vehicles being hit by returned fire, saw more of our boys dead and dying. By 4:30 that afternoon, the rest of our troops poured into the basin through Kasserine Pass. I expected to be blasted to kingdom come as we loaded, aimed and shot our anti-tank guns until we heard those welcome words, "Cease firing." At the end of the battle, my buddies and I lit cigarettes, trying to calm our nerves, and waited for our ears to stop ringing. One of my buddies congratulated me with typical German sarcasm. "Well, I see you lived to fight for another day." "Ja," I blurted out. "I like to be out of fearing Rangje whenever I can. I thank God that Allied fire missed me time and time again. I'm grateful that I was never seriously wounded and was able to recover emotionally from the sickening battles. Unlike many of my peers, I lived on to get married and to raise sons and daughters. Looking back on these bloody battles, I'm glad that none of my children had to be in combat, even though 3 of our boys were in the American Armed Forces. As for the Battle of Kasserine Pass, my last major battle, I read later that the Germans won this conflict but bungled the rest, due to the dual command at this point by General Rommel and General von Arnim. Both of them answered to Marshal Albert Kesselring in Rome, and both messaged him about their plans. General Rommel wanted to exploit German gains by striking Tebessa. Von Arnim did not. Kesselring ended up siding with Rommel, but by then precious time had been lost. During the 2 days the commanders bickered, the Allies gathered enough strength to repel Rommel. While the generals argued, von Arnim shifted our troops, intending to strike farther north. Rommel took time out to examine captured US war material, tanks, trucks, troop carriers and weapons. The abundance of supplies and the profusion of spare parts amazed him. By contrast, his forces were down to 1 day's ammunition and only 6 days' food. His vehicles had just enough gasoline to travel 120 miles. 3 days after the battle, Rommel flew to Germany to try to persuade Hitler to abandon North Africa entirely and thereby save the Afrika Korps from annihilation. Predictably, Hitler refused to listen to his argument and forbade the Desert Fox to return to Tunisia. "Africa will be held," the Führer snapped, "and you must go on sick leave." Hitler gave command of both armies to Colonel General von Arnim. As enlisted men, we knew very little about all this. When the next issue of our German army newspaper, The Oasis, reached us, we read that Rommel had fallen ill and von Arnim had replaced him. "Move out!" shouted my sergeant. We followed his lead, back in the direction we originally came, to a defensive position west of Kairouan. In April, an enormous force of American tanks attacked us in 2 skirmishes with ferocious hails of artillery. Shells flew, mortars burst, and bullets shot everywhere at once. This time, our unit was not as lucky. We couldn't move, our half-tracks had run out of fuel. Through bursts and bangs, I saw our anti-tank guns and half-tracks explode, saw our men lying dead or injured. We kept firing until we heard the order, "Retreat!" Those of us left standing abandoned our anti-tank guns and followed our sergeant into the hills. The beauty of spring in full bloom was lost on me. I felt dazed, shocked, and exhausted. The guys around me looked the same way. The loss of our vehicles turned us into foot soldiers, the infantry. With barely enough time to catch a breath, we marched off to an offensive that I later discovered to be Medjez El Bab. My unit was still attached to Gruppe Weber. The entire group included Panzergruppe Lang, with 77 tanks, 14 of them Tigers. Weber had 3 other groups, Gruppe Eder, Gruppe Audorf, and Gruppe Schmidt, with a battalion of panzers. Other regiments joined us, Göring's parachute unit, a mountain regiment, and the reserve group that included the 2 battalions of our regiment. The entire operation made a spoiling attack on the Medjez El Bab area. My unit attempted to take another hill, called Grenadier Hill, and seemed to be succeeding, but we heard an order: halt the attack. At that point, we marched up Longstop Hill, a location our side had held for 4 months. Longstop Hill, known to the natives as Jebel Amera, was about 2 miles long and about 690 metres high. Although it wasn't immediately apparent, Longstop had twin peaks of about the same height. This was an advantage for our side. Whoever held Longstop Hill commanded the valley all the way to Tunis, about 25 miles away. The next day, the Allies, preceded by wailing bagpipes, attempted to seize Longstop Hill. They attacked us over and over for the next 4 days. On the 3rd night, our beleaguered officers broke out what was left of their brandy and gave it to their troops to revive them. "Drink up," our sergeant said. "It will make you feel better." It may have relaxed my sore muscles, but the next morning I felt groggy and off balance. The battle resumed. In the midst of the furor, I was hit in the back and knocked flat on my face. I thought I had been pierced through with bullets. I was amazed when I peeked at my chest and didn't see any blood. Klaus, my teammate, checked me over. "How bad are you hit? There's some blood on your back." "I guess I'm okay," I said. He pulled me to my feet and examined me more closely. "Good God," he said. "It looks like you've been hit by our own shrapnel, but I'm alive," I thought. God is truly good. We didn't have time for Klaus to pick out the shrapnel, so he smeared my wounds with the sulphur cream we had been slathering on cactus punctures and scorpion bites. Then he taped on some bandages. Bagpipers tooted weird hoots and howls as they dogged us. Their savage shrieks sounded as if they were almost at our feet. Blasts of ammunition annihilated more of our men. Attack followed attack. Our response weakened. Even a private could see that we had run out of ammunition. New orders were shouted. "Retreat!" We scrambled to the rear and reassembled at the foot of the Atlas Mountains. We got our next order on a hill, dig in. Dirt flew thick and fast as soldiers dug as deep as possible for the next onslaught. Klaus and I dug madly, deeper and deeper, throwing dirt by the shovelful in every direction. We felt the Allies breathe down our necks. Finally satisfied with our work and hunkered down, we heard the unmistakable squeaks and rumbles of tanks grow louder as they bore down on us. Like young foxes in their dens, we tried to blend in with the desert until the sounds of war died away. The British considered the conflict between themselves and their German and Italian enemies a European war fought in Africa. Then Britain's allies, the Americans, got into the fray. They landed their mighty force of American men, vehicles and supplies in North Africa to link up with the British in November of 1942. They called it Operation Torch, a captive just 6 months after landing in Africa, marching with groups assembled in a makeshift POW compound. We were herded like a massive cattle drive toward trucks. Once again, we would make a journey. But to where this was of vital importance all around me. Guys muttered their concern like snapping turtles in a twofold pond. "I got to know," I mumbled, asked the guard. A kid named Bernard pleaded. Another guy added his encouragement. "You look harmless, antenna ears. Maybe the guards won't hurt you at that moment." I realized I didn't care. I wasn't afraid of the British anymore. I thought the enemy had already done their worst to me. What more could they do? a risk-taker by nature. I thought I might as well draw on the cultured English I had learned in school. I squeezed to the front. I addressed a guard with perfect English pronunciation and tonalities. "Where are we going to the port of Tunis?" he said flatly. "The sea." I quickly translated for my buddies. I couldn't believe my good fortune for a second. I smelled the heady mixture of sweat on sunburned skin and salty sea air that had been such a part of my childhood. Being near the sea again was almost like going home. I couldn't wait to see the Mediterranean. My heart pounded with excitement. Then I refocused on the British Guard in front of me. Reality struck hard. This was no summer vacation or even a day trip to the beach seaside, or not. This was war. About an hour later, the transports dropped us off at the harbour. Obviously, we were going to be relocated somewhere by ship. I twisted around for a last peek at Tunis as we clambered aboard our assigned coastal freighter. "Where is this ship headed?" I boldly asked a guard on board. I wanted my friends to know that I could be relied on to Algiers. He said, "Man, totally disappointed." I told an old guy named Tillman standing next to me, "We're just going to another African country. What did you expect?" Tillman sneered Spain, German sarcasm at its finest while fleeing. He and some others had hoped to commandeer boats at Cape Bond. If we could have made it to Spain, the Spanish would have helped them get home. The Spanish government had come out on top in a civil war that ended in 1939. They had secretly shored up their troops with the strength of German soldiers, our guards. British soldiers herded about 100 of us down to the hold of the ship. The hatch clanged and banged over our heads as the guards fastened it down. "We're stowed down here like a bunch of sorry rats." Tillman said, his eyes bugging out in panic. His friend Frank chimed in. "If we get torpedoed by one of our own submarines, we don't stand a chance. We'll go down like rats, huh?" An older man retorted. "We haven't got submarines in the Mediterranean. Hitler doesn't consider this area important enough to deploy submarines." The men around me visibly relaxed. I didn't believe it from what I remembered of Hitler's activities in the past. He definitely considered this sea important. "How long is this trip going to take?" "Do you think?" Bernard asked me. He huddled on the cold metal floor close by me. "I calculate a day or two I tried to make." Obviously, I needed medical attention, so he sent me to a British field hospital on the coast. I walked, of course, with 2 young British guards as escorts. The 3 of us ambled along nicely, even though I felt weak and wobbly. I was having a nice conversation with one of them until the other one poked me in the ribs with his gun and said, "Give me your watch." I got scared. We were alone on a street in a strange city. No one was in. Authority was watching, in fact. I didn't even see any natives about. These Tommies could do anything to me. They wanted, and no one would care. I took off the expensive Swiss watch my parents had given to me on my 16th birthday and handed it to him. "Your wallet," he said. "Can I keep the pictures of my family?" He nodded. My hands shook. But I removed the pictures of my family and held out the wallet. "Now your soldier's book," he said, and then added with a sly look on his face, "Where are your medals? I never got any. I'm just a private." I told him. He patted me down, didn't find anything else. Reluctantly, I gave him my booklet. My meagre possessions were now his trophies, his greed my loss. I thought with bitterness, without personal identification, I really felt like a nobody. Since childhood I had carried a wallet with my identification, and enough money to get home by the age of 13. I even carried a series of Youth Association membership cards with my identification papers to prove who you were or were not. Had been a matter of survival in Hitler's Germany. People were known to live or die according to the completeness of their papers. Now I was a long way from home, and for the first time completely defenceless, with no proof of who I was or even where I came from. My head pounded, I had cramps and malaise. I wanted to get away from the trophy hunter, and to lie down the hospital cots with their smooth, clean sheets felt like a piece of heaven. But just as I got comfortable and attacked by a German submarine in the harbour, resulted in more injured men, which led to the evacuation of all the non-critical cases in the hospital, I remembered my buddies in the hold of the ship had convinced themselves that there weren't any subs in the Mediterranean during the evacuation. The British carted me off to a train depot. I found myself on an American-controlled train going westward into the middle of Africa. On the train, I was astonished to be treated as well as any Allied soldier. British and American servicemen, as well as PW patients like me, were also on the train. I thought it ironic that as we passed through Allies-friendly French Algeria, the townsfolk waved French, British and American flags, not knowing that they were heralding German POWs too. We POW patients disembarked in Oran, Algeria, and transported to an American field hospital, a quiet, orderly place that felt immediately familiar. Seeing doctors taking medicine and convalescing had been part of my life since childhood. During my infancy, I had rickets attributed to my mother's starvation during the British blockade of Germany in World War I. In my hometown, rickets was commonly referred to as the British disease. My bones shattered easily and healed slowly. My gentle, kindly paediatrician, who happened to be Jewish, used to say I had glass bones. Jaundice had been another problem that needed my doctor's care. His treatment succeeded. The sickly child grew to healthy adolescence. So healthy I'd passed all the military physicals with high marks I was. Skinny but snapped back from injury and hardship with the freshness of youth at the American field hospital. I awoke one day feeling a lot better, but with the realization that I had lost track of time. "What's the date today?" I asked a nice American nurse, the 9th June 9th, 1943. She added for emphasis, probably thought I had shell shock or something. I bolted upright. "Wow, I had a birthday 2 days ago, and I didn't even know it." I said, "How old are you now, kid?" She asked. "You look about 14. 19. I said proudly. If I were home, my mother would bake a birthday cake for me. I added, the nurse turned to leave and we'd have a party. I said to her, retreating back. I could see that she was slowly shaking her head. Was it disbelief or sorrow? I couldn't tell. Her pained reaction started me thinking maybe she questioned why I had to be so far from home on my birthday, why all of us sick and injured boys, Axis and Allies alike, were so far from home during my quiet, relatively comfortable convalescence. I began to question it too. What was I doing here? Why were we fighting in the first place? I had been obedient out of training and habit. I did what I was told, and marched where I was ordered without question. Now suddenly I realized that I couldn't let things just happen anymore. My survival was up to me. I had already used up a large share of good luck or God's grace, depending how you looked at it. In 6 months of combat, the only injuries I had suffered were infections from the cactus thorns and scorpion bites in my legs, and from the small load of shrapnel in my back. Landing in an American hospital in the relative lap of luxury had used up better. Fortune, I found myself recovering from dysentery much faster than I wished. How could I delay my return to the POW camp in desperation? I asked men more ill than I for their stools. "You want my," they said, and then grinned. "Well, go ahead, take all you want, a little victory." They happily shared their loose stools, which I needed for the daily laboratory tests. But by midsummer I looked so hale and hearty. But not even this deception worked. The doctor judged me healthy and discharged me from the hospital. The Americans sent me back to a power of camp in Iran, where tens of thousands of POWs were funner LED in by train. The enormous camp was the embarkation point to permanent captivity. To my surprise, black French African troops guarded us. The only blacks I had ever seen in my life were some of the foreign sailors in my hometown. Like the sailors, the guards simply had a job to do, and were doing it. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the white French officers. These officers, whose country had been defeated and was occupied by Germany, clearly wanted to pay us back. Their glares and sneers conveyed personal grudges against us. They made it clear that they were going to make our lives as miserable as possible every day in the French-run camp. The POWs swayed in line during long roll calls in the heat. Many prisoners collapsed, yet somehow I grew stronger despite the scorching heat. The taunts I found strength in the face of adversity. God was with me, still my family was with me too. I remembered their faces, their last goodbyes, and my father's eyes. When he had ordered me to come back home with dry throat and dust clogging my nostrils, I stood in the wavering roll call lines and called out encouragingly to the men next to me, flex your knees, take deep breaths, think about cool mountain air. My father would have done no less later in our tents. Rumours circulated to get the latest information. I sought out Tillman, the old jerk on the freighter. He always managed to know what was going on. I joined a conversation he was having with his pal Frank. The British and the Americans are trying to figure out how to make the best use of all of our manpower. Deep furrows creased Tillman's forehead. I expect will be shipped out to work in their factories and on their farms. Pretty soon, what an inglorious end for the Africa course. I thought then I heard something alarming. We're going to be given to the French for the rest of the war. Frank said, I overheard some French guards talking about it. They're going to work us like slaves in their African mines. Tillman's horror reflected mine. I just knew something bad, like this would happen. Tillman didn't seem like such a jerk anymore. What an awful fate for an old guy. I wondered if he'd make it. I wondered if I could. I went looking for my new buddy Albert, whom I had gotten to know when we were patients at the American Field Hospital. He was 20 years old, a quiet little guy whose uniform always looked neat and whose chestnut brown hair always looked perfectly combed. I sidled up and quietly told him the rumour. I'll get claustrophobia if I have to work down in a mine. I said. Albert nodded. Yeah, I know I don't want to spend any more time in the ground. I even hated being down in a trench. There's got to be a way out. I told Albert while we discussed this latest rumour about French mining camps. The scheduled American roll call began several times a week. Americans came into our French-run camp and called out a list of POW names. The men thus chosen assembled at the entrance gate and boarded U.S. Army trucks never to be seen again. I heard a rumour that they're going to the United States. Tillman said, wow, I thought, how did they get so lucky? More importantly, how could I make some of that luck for myself? It came to me as the Americans called out the last of the German names. Albert, I whispered, you know how the French treat us, and you know how the Americans have treated us. He nodded eagerly. He knew I was brewing something up. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement myself. I say, let's go with the Americans, I said. But are those guys whose names are called really headed for America? Or are they going somewhere else? Albert was no fool. We didn't have much time to decide. It was now or never. Let's do it. I spoke. He nodded a sharp yes. A few days later, when the Americans called another list of names, Albert and I managed to linger close to the assembling group. Although our names were not called, we casually joined the line of POWs and melted in with them. We hopped on a truck with the others and were unloaded without incident at the harbour in Oran, where a convoy of Liberty ships was anchored. So far so good. Albert, I muttered, before looking up to see the guards begin a search of the POWs. It crossed my mind that maybe it had been a stroke of luck that my identification book had been stolen. Albert's had been taken by the Tommies too. Make sure you take everything shiny away from them, said the sergeant of the guards. I whispered a translation to Albert. The guards took our canteens, eating utensils and mirrors, and through the monopile I looked at the growing pile and thought more trophies for the Allied non-combatants. All I was left with was the sweaty uniform on my back. They never questioned who we were. We passed undetected. Why did they want shiny stuff? Albert asked later. Maybe they think we can use them for signalling German ships. German submarines roamed the ocean like sharks in the fall of 1943. Nerves. Raw and tension spent, we spouted sarcastic comments about the absurdity of an army private making contact with them. Know any maritime codes? Albert, nah, and even if I did, I don't want us to get torpedoed along with the other small group of selected POWs. Albert and I boarded a freighter under a Norwegian merchant marine captain, U.S. Navy destroyers, escorted our big convoy of Liberty ships. Our captain saw to it that each of us got a U.S. Army blanket since we had to sleep on the metal floor of the hold. He announced the rules. Only 50% of you at a time can be on deck during daylight at night. You will be closed into the hold. No bathroom facilities existed down under, so it was quite a relief to go topside every morning. The stench below was nauseating once on deck. I was allowed to climb a ladder to get some fresh air and watch the crew work. I spoke English with the American guards who looked friendly. I asked them questions about where we were and tried to figure out our position by scanning the coastline in the afternoon. I stayed down below and tried to console Albert. The poor guys suffered terribly from motion sickness and stayed below. Most of the time Albert had a litany of complaints when he wasn't retching. African mines would have been a picnic compared to this. Why did you talk me into it? I wish I hadn't listened to you soon. Our ship was running close to the Spanish coastline. We must be approaching the Straits of Gibraltar. I thought shouts in 2 languages rang out above. Why did you talk me into it? I wish I hadn't listened to you soon. Our ship was running close to the Spanish coastline. We must be approaching the Straits of Gibraltar. I thought shouts in 2 languages rang out above. I scrambled up the ladder and cocked my head out of the hatch. Bernard, the boy I met on the freighter, was bending over the rail for a good look. "What's going on?" I asked 2 of our men. "Dove overboard and are swimming towards Spain," Bernard said. "But they aren't making much headway. The cross currents here are too strong. They're probably going to drown yells of encouragement welled up from our men on the deck." "What's happening now?" I asked. A destroyer spotted them and they're throwing out life rings. A cheer went up. They've latched on, they're pulling them on board, more cheers. They're all right now. Bernard said Albert was all ears. "I wish I would have jumped overboard." He whimpered. His face was the colour of the metal floor. "I bet they're going to be treated a lot better on that destroyer than we are in this hole. I've never seen anyone dive and puke at the same time." I said, giving Albert a playful poke on the shoulder, "Can you even swim? God in heaven." Albert said. He rolled his eyes and leaned against the wall with his back to me. Poor Albert. He was so physically weak that he could barely climb up the ladder to get his water ration, much less swim. He had lost a great deal of weight because he was seldom able to eat. Our food consisted of cold sea rations out of the can. Pieces of wood from packing crates were our spoons. We cleaned out the empty food cans for the water ladled out to us on deck. We had to drink what we could right there. Only an acrobat could climb vertical ladders with one hand and hold an open can of water with the other. However, the problems we had with food and drink were of minor significance compared to the possibility of being blown out of the water by our own navy, since the ship we were on was not identified as carrying German prisoners. We worried as much as the Americans about German submarines torpedoing us. AGI told me that their troops needed entertainment to get their minds off the danger and boost morale. He asked me if the POWs who were taking their turn down in the hold would sing. It never occurred to me at the time, but I heard later on that the American sailors hoped German subs could hear the German words and songs, and therefore would not attack when they realized the ship carried a load of Germans. They realized this was true. Our singing may have saved our lives. One tune the American GIS asked for was the song of the German Submarine Corps. It has sung fortissimo, a war song full of boom, boom, booms. The Americans also liked the colonial African song Higher Safari. How often have we walked on narrow native trails through the steppe when the cool evening neared? How did we listen to the sounds, the well-known songs of the carriers and Ascaris native soldiers? Higher, higher, safari. Sometimes the Norwegian sailors asked for the World War II version as well. They even asked us to sing the rousing song of the Africa Corps, but their favourite was the melancholy love song. Lily Marlene discovered by German soldiers when they stormed a Yugoslavian radio station in Belgrade. We sang it in German, the sailors knew it in English. Singing soothed us. We felt less nervous, especially when we sang at the tops of our lungs. Even the GIs looked calmer as they listened to our 50 choirs. They appreciated our music so much that candy and cigarettes rained down on us from the deck after each song. Later I realized that the shower of gifts was to keep us singing. Our trip took longer in wartime than it would have in peacetime, because the convoy steered a zigzag course to put off the submarines day after day. The minute I hit the deck, I searched the horizon for signs of land. We sailed for a grueling 3 weeks. Everyone cheered when seagulls were sighted, indicating that land was close. Our nerve-wracking journey was coming to an end. A huge statue of a robed lady with a torch appeared in the horizon, the Statue of Liberty. We taunted our German submarines with one last chorus of their song. I shouted out the ending with a lusty boom. The inscription on the Statue of Liberty was too far off for me to see, but I knew that it read, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these the homeless, tempest-tossed to shore. Send lift my lamp beside the golden door, my wretched bodies," and I fit the description. Homeless. Yes, tempest-tossed definitely, and I would have given anything to be free from our captors, from Hitler and also from the German army, which had pulled the rug out from under us. The door to America was open, but I felt far from welcome when we finally disembarked on Ellis Island, New York. At Ellis Island, we were shown to shower rooms with luxurious foaming soap, thick clean towels and hot water, freshly scrubbed, shampooed, shaven and deloused. We were even given clean new undergarments, throw away the Nazi direct, said a grinning guard while we scrubbed guys, cleaned up and disinfected our uniforms. This was more hospitality than we expected. I was glad to be rid of my coating of grime and was aching to be settled somewhere after we cleaned up sufficiently. Another guard pointed us toward a train. Albert and I boarded Pullman cars along with hundreds of other POWs. Each of us had his own upholstered seat. See how much better America is already. This is a big improvement over German freight cars, I whispered to Albert. He was his old self again, though a bit weak, and he nodded his head in agreement. He was eyeing the MPS military police who were on guard at each end of the car. They were uniformed smartly and fully equipped with submachine guns. The MPS told us the rules: stay seated. You are not allowed to walk around. After that, all I had left were pictures of my family, which were worth more to me than gold. The personal effects page stayed blank. The last step in the processing was the best I was motioned to a supply window to pick up a new uniform. I could hardly believe that the full duffel bag tossed over the counter was just for me. 4 pairs of trousers, 2 in cotton and 2 in wool. A bet 5 short-sleeve and long-sleeve shirts in khaki denim and wool and socks underwear, gloves, a jacket, a coat, a raincoat, a cap, and new shoes. Albert was as happy as I was to get new clothes and couldn't wait to get to our barracks to put them on, a supply sergeant said. In bad German, "In your barracks, you will find white paint and a stencil of the letters. PW paint the letters. PW on your uniforms, the backs of your shirts and jackets, the fronts of your trousers, and on the sides of your shirts and pants." I wish I didn't have to put paint on them. Albert said, "Everything is so clean and fresh. Think of it this way, Albert. These are way better than the ragged, torn-up uniforms we left behind on our last retreat." "Yeah," a guy behind me said. "And the white paint makes a perfect target for the American guards, too. Your Teutonic mind is overworked." I told him the idiot. I thought, why would the Americans bring us all this way just to shoot us in my naivete? I couldn't foresee how the interplay between ordinary POWs like us and the Nazis would clash with our young guards. They probably thought all of us were Nazis. We were allowed to keep our German uniforms to wear inside the camp on holidays. According to the regulations of the Geneva Convention, as I washed mine and put it in the bottom of my duffel bag, I thought that I never wanted to see it again. Little did I know that I would put it on one more time for a show of respect at a funeral in an American POW camp for 2 of my closest buddies during the slack time in processing. I listened to my fellow prisoners tell their stories. The men ranged in age from 19 to 40 and had been trained in vocational schools and technical colleges, skilled school teachers, stonemasons, electricians, and every other profession were represented. The Third Reich had abruptly terminated the civilian jobs in which they had taken pride. They knew they were lucky to have survived the Africa campaign, yet they did not feel completely relieved, All of their physical and mental energy had been spent fighting. Now that they were idle, they were worried, homesick, anxious, depressed, and angry by turns. Many had left wives and children behind in Germany and despaired over their fate. The men suffered from barbed wire sickness. They felt powerless to help themselves, let alone their loved ones. Some of the older men tried to pull themselves together in order to comfort others feeling more homesick than ever before. We tried to find friends who came from the same home areas. Those who spoke the same dialect would know the same towns, heroes' folklore and songs. I listened for the pronunciation familiar to my area and found my group we would be able to stay in the same barracks. I learned in a lecture at the end of our processing day, the camp commander said to us through an interpreter, we must all make the best of the situation. He explained the rules, medical and dental services, and how to write and send letters home. He ended by explaining the punishment that would be enforced for escapes or intended escapes, isolation in the stockade, for a length of time that would be determined by the type of offence. Then he dismissed us to find our new homes. A man named Ralph came from Hamburg, a city closed to my hometown. He was a quiet older man who had been a teacher we heeded. Out toward our new barracks, located somewhere in the group of drabs, black tar paper barracks, the camp was divided into 3 compounds. Each compound consisted of 20 barracks, as well as mess halls, a workshop, a canteen, an infirmary, an administrative building, and a recreation hall. A barrack was 20 feet by 100 feet and consisted of a concrete slab floor and structure of wood, 2x4s covered with tar paper. The Army Corps of Engineers used this same plan in all 155 POW camps constructed. Rolf scanned our barrack. It's not the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, but since we're in a small town, we can't expect much. Even so, I think we should reserve rooms. What a joker. That Roth, New York's most famous hotel, was owned by a German immigrant named Waldorf. Do you think they have room service? I couldn't resist. We soon found out that the locals who lived near such camps didn't think we had anything to joke about. They thought we had it too good. They called POW camps the Fritz Ritz. Inside each barrack were about 100 cots in rows with hooks along the wall for hanging up our issued clothes and our duffel bags. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the centre aisle. Rolf and I found 2 empty cots next to each other. After the few minutes it took to stow our gear, we flopped down on the cots. I stared up at the ceiling. Now reality set in here. I was a teenager and a prisoner of war, complete with serial number. I thought about what my parents would be expecting of me in such circumstances. They were practical people who had lived through 2 wars. They never panicked. I, as well as my sister, had learned to cope with wartime conditions from following their examples. But neither parent could have predicted this outcome and prepared me for captivity. I could not shake off my feelings of foreboding. I sat up on the edge of my bunk and stared into space. Let's check this place out. This came from Rolf. He was really old, about 35, but he always surprised me with his energy, which was catching. He went outside. I followed him. Walkways, gravel roads, and a wide flat area LED beyond our compound. We could see 2 other compounds of about 20 barracks each. The compound held a washroom and an open field for inspections. And sports beyond the fences. We could see the Hospital Chapel US Post Office and what looked like a warehouse. The camp looked like any other army camp, but it had one major difference. We were surrounded by a double set of barbed wire fences, 10 feet high. We were observed from watchtowers with power searchlights to keep even better tabs on us. A single barbed wire fence isolated the individual compounds. We could see the young GI guards scowling at us and wondered how well trained they were for the job. We joked back and forth about the fact that they looked like kids had never left their mummies. I saw fear in their eyes when they looked at us. They saw dangerous fighters' soldiers who would stop at nothing to kill or escape. In reality, the only thing Rolf and I were fighting was depression. We were prisoners of the enemy in the enemy's country, a situation never covered in our army training manual. I resolved to keep my wits about me. I wanted to go home to see my family again. I found it hard to understand or trust the fact that the Americans were so generous with food, clothing, and shelter. I asked Ralph what he thought about it. He pulled his pipe and tobacco out of his pocket. I think they're practicing the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He lit his pipe before he continued. You know there are American POWs in Germany. You mean that the Americans hope that if they treat us well, that Germany will hear about it and do the same? I asked, yes, I'm. Sure, I've asked. Yes. Boggled the mind, obviously they knew little about the SS Hitler's private army, which controlled the entire war effort. I was certain that the godless SS didn't even know the golden rule. They made there the godless. Aside, we had other problems. The worst was the heat and the humidity of Hearne, Texas. As enlisted men, Rolf and I got strenuous job assignments. We had both grown up in the cool northern coastal climate of Germany and Denmark. I had never become accustomed to the hot days and cold nights of North Africa. It astonished me that this new POW camp in Texas was even hotter than North Africa. Hard labour in the Texas sun was grueling, but if I didn't work, I didn't get paid. The stuff I could buy with the little bit of money I earned each day meant a lot to me. A Coke, a candy bar and cigarettes. I enjoyed them as I read news of the outside world free of charge via the New York Times. My daily ordeal began at 5:30. Reveille 6 US breakfast of bread and jam and a strange food called corn flakes in Germany. Only animals ate corn. 6:30. Shave, shower, clean the barracks. 7:30. Roll call and work assignments. Hard physical work under the broiling sun, mowing, raking and weeding. The enormous grounds. 12 Burr brown bag lunch out in the field. A sample menu was typically potato salad, roast pork, carrot sticks, and ice water. One more hard work under the sun, until quitting time at 4:30. A lot of men collapsed from heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Those of us still mobile at supper at 6 goal. A typical menu was meatloaf, scrambled eggs, milk and bread. Not exactly my mother's cooking, but at least I filled my stomach completely for the first time in years. The scourge of the heat and the strong sun created a cottage industry. Since the caps, the US Army supply didn't keep the sun out of our eyes. Some of the men in my labour group set up a little business of making broad-billed caps out of our heavy cotton mattress covers. Their design was original and practical. Hard-working enlisted men placed orders and bought them with their own money. The caps gave us identity. I put mine on my head at a cocky angle. We were a hardy and resourceful bunch. I adjusted to the heat. Often I was one of the few men left standing at the end of the day. One day I was rewarded with duty outside the camp, fences hacking weeds with a big sharp scythe along the main road. I lashed my way down to a crossroads when a car came toward me and stopped. I looked back at my group spread out on both sides of the road. Some distance back, the guard had his back to road. An old man leaned out the window of the car and called to me, "Howdy, which way is the POW camp right down the road behind me?" I said politely in my best English, "And you might like to know I'm one of them." He gave me a startled look and sped off in a shower of gravel. I looked down at my clothes with POW stenciled in white in every conspicuous spot and had to chuckle. That was my only light moment at work on those hot early days in Camp N-Cos. Non-commissioned officers from sergeant up to lieutenant were treated differently from US enlisted men. NCOs were given the job of running the camp internally. They did not have to do any other work unless they wanted more pay than their weekly dole of $3. The NCOs put their minds to all kinds of projects. To this day, photographs can be found in military archives that testify to their ingenuity at the camp in Hearne. The NCOs designed and erected a perfect scale model of one of King Ludwig's Bavarian castles. Complete with stairs and a working moat, they mixed and poured tons of donated cement and converted everyday objects into doors, windows, and embellishments. Germans and Americans alike admired the workmanship of these inventive men who used their skills to keep mentally alert and physically active. Not all activity in the camp was as benign or straightforward. The majority of Germans held captive were battle-hardened veterans of the Africa campaign. Although Germany was taking heavy losses on the Eastern Front and the air war over Germany had intensified, there was still a strong allegiance toward our homeland and our government, and a belief in victory. I had quietly discarded my belief in a German victory after seeing the overwhelming amount of war material owned by the Allies in North Africa. My observations on our train ride from New York to Texas, as we passed cities industrious by day and fully lit at night, added to my skepticism. No blackouts here. The Americans didn't worry about getting bombed in Germany. They worried about it day and night. It had become common knowledge that the camp in Herne was one of more than 150 such camps where POWs were sent. In addition, we heard that there were about 500 branch camps. If the abundance of supplies in a small camp like Herne was typical, Germany was doomed. I often told myself I was probably in the best place I could be under the circumstances. I could be starved or tortured or fighting in, God knew what conditions. Then I'd see the barbed wire fences surrounding me, and I wasn't sure how I hated that barbed wire. However, it never occurred to me to escape, although I spoke English. Where could I go? I certainly couldn't get back to Germany. Someone else tried to escape, though probably from a sense of duty. A tough die-hard, he wore civilian clothing over his German uniform. His military training did him in, however, because as he walked along a country road, he sang German marching songs to keep up his courage. A farm woman heard him and turned him in. Some people deserve their fate. According to reports, fewer than 1% of the 360,000 German POWs escaped. Most of the escapees were apprehended within 24 hours. Large camps experienced no more than 3 to 4 escapes during the war. Top military brass in Washington, D.C., were pleased to find that they were not faced with the chaos of hundreds of thousands of uncontrollable individuals, but rather with a tight, obedient military unit in which each rank was responsible to its direct superior for its actions. This disciplinary tactic seemed sound to our captors, but it led to a disastrous strengthening of German militarism and Nazism inside the camps. News of the war was accessible to us in the New York Times, which published the communiques of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Soviets. Over time, I began to get closer to the truth. Exaggerations of successes and the downplaying of losses and setbacks occurred on both sides. I remembered my uncle Hani listening to the radio in Germany and telling me there's an old saying, "The first casualty of war is truth on days we didn't get the newspaper." Rolf and I speculated on the reason for its absence. The Allies must have had a setback, Rolf would say, or our side must have won a battle for a change. The only worthwhile news came from my family, now that we were allowed to send letters through the International Red Cross. I wrote to my parents in Kiel on airmail forms, which were similar to the light paper airmail forms of today. My mother wrote back immediately since she knew that letters took months to be delivered. Both sides censored the mail. One side blacked out words and the other side cut them out. All that was usually left were greetings and personal information. Mother's letters were always cheerful and supportive.